Welcome to the Silent Empires, where we uncover the forgotten stories and powerful moments that shaped our world. Each tale is told in a way that draws you in and keeps you listening until the very end. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'd love to see how far our empire of listeners reaches. And if you enjoy journeys into history told with depth and intrigue, don't forget to subscribe and be part of our growing community. Now, let's begin. Listen for a moment. With the lights low and your breathing easy, picture a face that could charm a room and freeze it in the same breath. A man who hated the nickname history gave him, a planner who believed he could turn a patch of desert into a palace of light. Some knew him as Benjamin Siegel, others as Bugsy, a label he despised. He wore tailored suits like armor, smiled like he owned the sidewalk, and walked into rooms as if each one were a stage. His story isn't a fairy tale, and it isn't fiction. It's the real path of a poor kid from Brooklyn who moved through street corners, smoky back rooms, film studios, and a neon dream called Las Vegas. There are crimes in this story, illegal deals, violence told without detail, a life full of risky decisions and consequences. None of it is celebrated here. This is a bedtime telling for grown listeners, a calm guide through facts and widely reported accounts, careful with the edges, mindful of the rules, and carried by the question that follows him even now. How did a boy with nothing imagine a kingdom in the sand? Benjamin Siegel arrived in the world on February 28, 1906, in Brooklyn, New York, the son of immigrant parents who had crossed an ocean to find steadier ground. The neighborhood was tough, crowded, and noisy, a place where factory whistles measured the day and where success showed up rarely, usually wearing somebody else's shoes. His father worked long hours. His mother stretched every coin. A young boy learned early that safety and comfort weren't guaranteed, and that power often came to those willing to take it. He grew fast, restless, and sharp-eyed, the kind of teenager who noticed who had the money and who had to ask for it. The streets taught lessons that no school offered. In that world, he found Meyer Lansky, a quiet thinker with a steady mind and a long memory. The two saw something in each other, a balance of daring and calculation, and together they began to build a small street crew that would later be known by a name people remembered. The Bugs and Meyer mob. Those were not polished times. They were hustlers, and they ventured into the types of hustles that were common for kids who wanted a faster climb and had no patience for the slow ladder. They started with small-time schemes and moved up. Early on, they ran protection rackets aimed at peddlers and shop owners. It was wrong and harmful. It brought money and enemies. Under Prohibition, when alcohol became illegal and the thirst for it only grew, they moved into bootlegging, moving liquor, guarding trucks, and protecting routes. They were not alone. New York was full of crews staking corners and truck lines. The effort to move liquor created a wider network, and that network turned the two friends into partners who could sit at tables with bigger names. In those years, Siegel stood out. He dressed well even when he couldn't really afford it. He carried himself with a boldness that signaled he meant business, and word spread that he could be charming and, when pressed, dangerous. People started calling him Bugsy, a nickname derived from bugs, as in crazy, unpredictable. He hated it. He preferred Ben or Mr. Siegel. The name followed him anyway, a brand he never asked for and never shook. Relationships mattered in that era, more than anything. The pair connected with Charles Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and other figures who were reshaping the underworld from an old-world family-bound feud into a modern network that put profit first. Siegel and Lansky weren't the top leadership, but they had the ears of people at the top. They built reputations as reliable earners and capable enforcers. Siegel's skills fit the moment, quick to read a room, bold enough to act, and devoted to his closest allies. The late 1920s brought turbulence to New York's criminal world. The Castellamarese War raged between old guard bosses and up-and-coming leaders. It shook every crew. In 1931, it ended with two high-profile killings that cleared the path for Luciano's reorganization. Many writers and witnesses later said Siegel assisted the new order in that volatile time. Some accounts even claim he took part in operations tied to those final days, though the exact details remain debated. What is clear is that after the smoke lifted, Luciano and his circle, which included Lansky, built a coordinated structure sometimes called the National Crime Syndicate. Jewish, Italian, and other gangs cooperated across city lines, setting prices, sharing territories, and managing disputes to keep the money flowing. Siegel's status rose with that tide. The new structure needed discipline. Around that time, an enforcement arm developed that the press would call Murder Incorporated. Largely associated with figures like Louis Buchalter and Albert Anastasia, Siegel was close to many of the people in that world. Reports from the era and later histories connect him to those circles and describe him as a man who did not flinch when the organization demanded firm action. Hard lines were part of the business. None of that is romantic. It is simply part of the record that he moved in violent company, oversaw rackets that harmed others, and took pride in being effective. Lawful conduct wasn't the path he chose. Even as his name grew in underground accounts, he tried to build a life that looked normal from the sidewalk. In 1929, he married Esta, his longtime girlfriend. They would have 2 daughters. At home he could be calm, attentive, even sweet by many recollections. He pushed for good schools for his children. He bought nice furniture. He liked flowers in the window and a neat tie on the dresser. These small, ordinary details built a separate picture from his working life, and that contrast followed him forever. A family man to those he loved, and a feared operator to those who knew him only on the street. During Prohibition, he focused on money-making schemes that the era rewarded. He invested in illegal gambling rooms and speakeasies, placed trusted men at doors and cash boxes, and learned how to keep police raids from landing where they might hurt him most. He worked hijacking operations that took contraband off trucks. He sat with bookmakers and studied the numbers. He learned that information could be more valuable than muscle, and that controlling a network delivery schedules, pickup times, the rumor mill could tilt the odds in his favor. This would matter years later, when he began to care less about backroom brawls and more about the speed of a telegram. Prohibition ended in 1933, and with it, the easy profits from bootlegging dried up. The smartest players shifted to new ventures: gambling, extortion, union manipulation, and the race wire for bookmakers became core businesses. The wire service moved horse racing results to bookmakers around the country in near real time. Whoever controlled the flow of those results controlled a money river. Siegel understood the stakes and began reaching toward that kind of infrastructure, aligning with partners who had technical skills, access to phone lines, and the right introductions. He saw the future in networks. By the mid-1930s, New York law enforcement turned up the heat. Prosecutors like Thomas E. Dewey chased major figures for a range of crimes, from vice to tax violations. Luciano's conviction in 1936 on vice-related charges sent a chill through the ranks and made many associates reconsider their visibility. Siegel, who had already been traveling, looked west. California offered new angles: fresh rackets, a booming film industry, and the chance to blend with glamorous circles where attention looked different and whispers vanished into studio gossip. Before that move, his New York years left a trail. Accounts describe him taking a share of illegal gambling dens, protecting trucks carrying illicit loads, and lending support to organized enforcement when disputes crossed into violence. Newspapers linked him to intimidation and extortion schemes, though he rarely faced convictions that stuck. He kept his distance whenever possible, relied on layers of associates, and used charm to soothe where force would have drawn headlines. He liked to be seen at nice restaurants, to be thought of as a businessman, and to speak in a calm voice unless pressed. It was an image, and he worked at it. His circle widened beyond the underworld too. He knew people in nightclubs, stage acts, and the first generation of truly national entertainers. He appreciated good music and expensive cocktails. He viewed America's rising love of show business as a mirror he could step into. If you looked like a star, you would be treated like one. Confidence brought opportunities. He practiced walking into rooms with grace, never rushing, never apologizing for where he Saturday. He handled introductions as if he had been born to them. By 1937, he set his sights firmly on Los Angeles. The city glowed with studio lights and moneyed crowds, and it had its own underworld turf that could be navigated with the right patience. Moving west would also put distance between him and New York investigations. He told friends he would look after business on the Pacific coast, help manage the race wire, and explore casino ventures beyond California's borders, where gambling laws were looser. Nevada was close, and its rules offered space for legal casinos that could be influenced and supplied by illegal networks. He could see a chain of opportunities stretching from downtown clubs to desert towns. The move was not a quiet retreat, it was a strategic expansion. In the years ahead, Siegel would present himself as a businessman among producers and stars, visit studio lots, and dine in Beverly Hills houses where the silverware shone and stories carried across lawns. He would become known for a light touch, a quick joke, and a shallow bow to courtesy that softened skeptical hosts. He could turn on the charm for a director in the afternoon and talk tough to a bookmaker after midnight. The contrast made him intriguing and, for people who had only known street gangsters in rough suits, confusing. From the start, he sought partnerships that could profit from the race wire. Bookmakers made their living on speed and accuracy. If the last race result arrived 30 seconds late, it could cost a small fortune. Siegel aligned with men who controlled local exchanges and negotiated with out-of-state services to smooth the flow. That business brought legal attention. Authorities raided wire rooms and arrested runners. Even so, the network grew, and with it, his influence. It was the same skill from the old days, recast for a modern age. Organize information, keep reliable people at critical points, and use momentum to make rivals hesitate. Even as he burrowed into West Coast ventures, parts of his past still held claims on him. Old enmities and unsettled grudges didn't vanish with a change of address. Newspapers would, in time, link his name to a notorious Los Angeles murder case tied to a former associate from New York, a case that drew national attention and made him a household name for people who had never been near a bookie window. That story belongs to the next stretch of his life, when courts and headlines chased him as eagerly as studio gossip did. For now, in the late 1930s, he stood at a crossroads with 2 maps in his pocket, a careful plan for expansion, and a long list of risks. It is important to say clearly that none of this was innocent. The rackets he managed hurt people. The money that flowed into his world came from illegal gambling, extortion, and schemes that corrupted public systems. The charm did not erase that harm. The tidy homes and family photos did not undo it. The talent he had for organization and persuasion could have built legitimate companies. He chose a different direction, one that paid quickly and demanded loyalty enforced by fear. That choice defined his reputation more than any suit he wore or car he drove. And yet, to understand why his story still draws listeners, you have to see the next shape he tried to cut out of the map. The idea that Las Vegas could become a modern resort, not just a roadside casino town, and that a glamorous hotel could change the desert forever. Before that vision took hold, he was still transitioning, still smoothing ties in Los Angeles, still building a bridge from the underworld into circles that liked their deals quiet and their parties loud. The man who hated his nickname was learning a new stage, and he played his part well enough to earn a seat at large tables. He told friends he was after something bigger than the day's take, something that would last. He had always chased scale, larger routes, larger rooms, larger networks. The next step would be the largest attempt of his life. But ambition collects debts. In his business, partners did not forget cost overruns, broken promises, or whispers about missing money. The tension between dream and discipline would become the tightrope he walked, with very little margin for error. Before we reach that balance beam, consider the boy on a Brooklyn stoop looking at the sky above tenements, thinking there must be more and deciding to grab it. That decision powered everything that followed. The first small shakedowns, the prohibition escapades, the meetings with rising bosses, the move west under heat, the film world friendships, the race wire deals, the gentle smile that hid a hard edge. It's a real life, not a legend. The facts are public, the rumors many, and the consequences final. Tomorrow's part brings California into focus movie stars, wire rooms, a high-profile murder case with Siegel in the dock, and the hush of courtrooms where his name echoed in a way he did not like. After that, the sand starts glowing with neon. For now, close your eyes and hold the shape of ambition you can almost touch. A man stepping off a train in Los Angeles, shoulders square, hat tipped forward, ready to be known by a city that loves a good entrance. He stepped off the train into a city scented with orange blossoms and damp studio fog, a place that sold dreams for cash and kept secrets in every booth along Sunset. Los Angeles in 1937 glimmered even at noon. Soundstage doors rumbled, extras hurried past in borrowed uniforms, and agents floated between lunches, press calls, and quick deals. Benjamin Siegel fit the frame, as if a casting director had written him into the picture. Confident stride, neat tie, hat tilted just enough to suggest ease. He wasn't hiding, he was setting a scene. He found his way to places where reputations were built in an hour. The Trocadero, Ciro's, the brown derby tables packed with producers, actors, gossip columnists, and hopefuls. He met George Raft, the dancer-turned-film star, whose roles drew on a background not far from Siegel's. Their friendship opened doors. Studio heads were curious about this smooth visitor with a New York pedigree, and society hosts liked the way he told a story without strain. He listened more than he spoke. He laughed quickly. He tipped well. He seemed like a man on the verge of a legitimate fortune. Behind the charm, he worked. The plan was precise. Control the fast flow of horse racing results that bookmakers depended on. The results service news bulletins sent through leased phone lines and teletype machines was the bloodstream of gambling in that era. Whoever managed it could charge fees, direct traffic, and keep rivals off balance. Siegel and his partners moved in on the West Coast distribution. They convinced some operators with polite promises of better service and fairer rates. Others felt pressure. Independent bookmakers who resisted found their access disrupted, their phones strangely unreliable, their offices visited by men who suggested that cooperation avoided trouble. Reports and later testimony describe how he brought that network to heel, piece by piece, until the transmission lines out of Los Angeles carried signals he controlled. He understood that the city's Italian syndicate had history and muscle. Jack Dragna held sway over many local rackets and expected respect. Siegel extended it when useful and ignored it when necessary. Sometimes they met, shook hands, and divided profits. Sometimes, according to police intelligence memos, they bumped into each other's plans and scowled through intermediaries. Siegel had an edge Dragna lacked. Connections that stretched from New York to Chicago, and a growing partnership with a tough young Angeleno named Mickey Cohen. Cohen, a former boxer turned bookmaker, became Siegel's point man in street operations, collecting payments, smoothing disputes, and showing up when a message needed weight, always careful in public, but blunt in private. The two made an effective pair, one polished, one punchy, both ambitious. Los Angeles nightlife offered more than dancing and camera flashes. Hidden behind polished bars and velvet ropes, card rooms buzzed, dice clattered, and roulette wheels turned. Many of these salons operated in a gray zone, tolerated when quiet, rated when headlines were needed. Siegel invested in several, placed reliable managers at the pit, and kept doormen trained to watch for uniforms and reporters. Slot machines, backroom poker, private baccarat, he took percentages everywhere he could. The money arrived in quiet bundles, went out as payroll and bribes, and returned as investments in better phones, faster cars, and houses with manicured lawns. He also stepped into social circles far removed from tenement stoops. A romance with Countess Dorothy DeFrasso, a wealthy widow with European ties, pulled him into apartments where artwork matched the silver, and guests spoke 3 languages. They traveled, even overseas. Stories from friends say he visited Italy and returned impressed with continental manners and hotel style. Some accounts suggest he explored deals abroad that skirted rules and sought quick profits. None of those plans ripened into lasting business, but they added to his legend. He came back to California with fresh tastes, hand-cut suits, finer linen, a preference for good china, and the certainty that a glamorous facade could help him pass as a businessman among the city's elite. Police attention tracked him quickly. Raids on wire rooms in downtown office buildings turned up clattering machines and stacks of betting slips. Bookies were arrested, fined, and sometimes released before dinner. The sheriff's office learned his routines and watched his clubs. He dodged some charges, beat others in court, and paid for lawyers who could stall investigations long enough for the heat to cool. Arrest reports from the late 1930s and early 1940s show his name linked to gambling, bookmaking, and the transmission of race results. Convictions were rare. He kept buffers in place, made himself difficult to pin down, and used his growing social standing as a kind of shield. Then came a case that pushed him into national headlines. On a cool night in late 1939, Harry Big Greenie Greenberg, a former associate tied to East Coast rackets, was slain in Los Angeles. Prosecutors argued that Greenberg had become a liability and that figures connected to a broader enforcement arm arranged his death. They placed Siegel in the center of the planning, and after months of work, they charged him with murder. The indictment jolted Hollywood. Newspapers splashed his photo on front pages and gave him a new label, Glamour Gangster. Courtrooms filled with reporters. He walked in wearing a perfect suit and a calm face. He proclaimed innocence. The state leaned on witnesses from the shadow world, men who had turned informant under pressure from other prosecutions back east. One of those men, Abe Rellis, was expected to be a key voice linking Siegel to the Greenberg killing. Before he could testify in California, he died in New York under protection, falling from a hotel window in a case that remains controversial. With Rellis gone and other witnesses either recanting or compromised, the prosecution faltered. After a long fight and a widely covered trial, Siegel was acquitted in early 1942. From a legal standpoint, he walked free. From a public standpoint, his name was burned into memory. Acquittal didn't mean peace. He had survived a courtroom scare, but the glare made anonymity impossible. Some producers kept their distance. Others shrugged and kept inviting him to parties. George Raft stood by him, introducing him at tables and in living rooms where rumors were treated as another topic for after-dinner chat. Siegel, mindful of the stakes, leaned harder into his businessman persona, talking about real estate, restaurants, and racing stables, even as his main income continued to draw from bookmakers' fees and club percentages. During the war years, he doubled down on the Results Network. National control of the horse racing newsline shifted as old owners faced tax charges and new management aligned with organized groups in Chicago. Siegel worked to secure West Coast distribution, ensuring that local bookmakers relied on channels he and his partners influenced. Records and later investigations describe a mix of persuasion and pressure, offers of better speed, claims of reliability, and warnings that turning away would invite trouble. Independent operators found it difficult to survive if they refused affiliation. Some were pushed out, some paid to stay in. He took a cut and kept the lines humming. He also moved to co-opt labor influence around clubs and wire rooms. Union ties, when leveraged, could keep inspectors away and ensure that sympathetic hands ran the switches. He wasn't the first to use labor for leverage in Los Angeles, and he wasn't the only one charged in these kinds of schemes. But his name carried an aura that made every allegation sound bigger. In these years, federal agents watched, grand juries convened, and press stories sketched a picture of a quiet empire built on illegal gambling, intimidation, and information control. People close to him said he remained calm through it all, taking lunch on sunlit patios, kissing his daughters on the forehead, and then driving off to oversee meetings that never appeared on paper. His personal life changed again when he met Virginia Hill. She was striking, quick with a retort, and known to people in Chicago and New York circles as someone who could carry a message and keep her own counsel. Their connections sparked gossip instantly. They moved through Beverly Hills dinners and late-night clubs as a pair. Hill later bought a fine house, and he spent much of his time there. Investigators would later allege that she helped him move money and cover expenses in ways that kept transactions hard to trace. She denied wrongdoing and kept her privacy tight. Together they projected a powerful image. Modern, stylish, loud when they wanted to be, quiet when strategy demanded. With Hill, he let his taste expand. He liked bright kitchens and art on the walls, good liquor in crystal decanters, tailored shoes, lined up like soldiers. He drove fast cars but insisted his tie be straight, even when he was late. He had a temper but learned to leash it in salons where a sharp word could cost him a deal. He mocked the nickname that followed him in headlines and asked friends to use his given name. Around close allies, he could be warm, generous, even protective. Around business rivals, he was cool as a coin flipped in the air. Law enforcement kept up the pressure. He faced more arrests on gambling-related counts, was questioned about extortion, and was linked to raids that shut machine rooms and betting shops. Outcomes varied, charges dismissed, fines paid, cases delayed until evidence thinned. Nothing put him away for long. That pattern allegations, Publicity, narrow escapes added to his mystique and fueled resentment among both police and competitors. Every escape also deepened expectations among his partners. If he could stay free, he should continue to deliver. By the mid-1940s, his attention shifted to Nevada. Las Vegas was a small desert town then, a whistle stop with wide streets, a railroad depot, and a scattering of legal casinos that drew travelers from Los Angeles and beyond. The state's permissive gaming laws made it a haven for operators who wanted open doors instead of back rooms. Siegel and his associates saw opportunity. He and his longtime partners invested in the El Cortez, an early downtown property with steady foot traffic. The investment ran into trouble as authorities in Nevada took a harder look at ownership. Police scrutiny made gaming licenses hard to secure for men with reputations like his, so the group sold their interest at a profit and bided their time. Even that brief dip told him what he needed to know. The desert could be honest gold if presented with elegance. Back in California, he continued to rake in money from the results service and club holdings, but he began to talk about something more lasting than a wire room. He wanted a resort that felt like a European hotel transported to American sand. He spoke of gardens, white stone, fine linens, and an experience that would pull guests from across the country. He envisioned dining rooms that looked like film sets and suites that felt like private retreats. To friends, he described a place where couples could stroll under trees while music drifted from a bandstand, and where the casino would be just one part of a larger escape. That vision found a starting point when he met Billy Wilkerson, the publisher of The Hollywood Reporter, and a man with his own taste for high living. Wilkerson had begun planning a refined casino hotel on Highway 91 south of downtown Las Vegas. He named it the Flamingo and started buying land, ordering materials, and sketching a modern, streamlined design. The war had just ended. Materials were scarce, costs rose. Wilkerson, facing mounting bills, needed a partner with deep pockets and fast connections. Siegel had both. Introductions were made. Talks followed. Before long, he arranged for syndicate funds to flow into the project and, through pressure and charm, took control. Once he was in charge, the scale changed. He demanded top-of-the-line fixtures, ordered imported tiles and custom furniture, and insisted on a standard of finish Las Vegas had never seen. He hired architects and contractors in clusters, replaced some when timelines slipped, and pushed crews to work around the clock. He added bungalows, planned a pool like a blue coin set in a garden, and requested kitchens that could plate meals as well as any Beverly Hills club. He wanted a showroom that would land name acts, a casino where the felt was new every day, and service that matched the best hotels in Los Angeles. The choices carried a price. Budgets doubled, then doubled again. Syndicate partners back east listened to updates with narrowing eyes. They wanted receipts, summaries, and firm dates. He gave them speeches about long-term value, pressure-cooked optimism, and vows that opening night would justify everything. He wasn't lying about the dream. He believed it, but the accounts showed gaps, and whispers started to follow those numbers. Cost overruns blamed on wartime shortages, mismanagement, skimming by subcontractors, and rumors that cash intended for the project leaked through side doors. Investigators later said Virginia Hill made trips to Mexico and Switzerland during this period, depositing money for her own reasons. The allegation hardened into lore. She said she traveled and kept her independence. The debate never ended, and the paper trail was thin by design. Even with questions swirling, he kept pouring energy into the Flamingo. He studied hotel blueprints, argued about wallpaper, checked the angles of neon. He walked the property in a white shirt with sleeves rolled, pointing, adjusting, promising. He courted entertainers to perform. He persuaded suppliers to deliver faster. He sent for chefs and maitre d's with the right accents and the right touch. He pushed and pushed, certain that a spectacular finish would silence doubts and put him, finally, in the clear as a legitimate hotelier. Around him, the larger picture of his career remained what it had always been. Illegal gambling interests, influence over the racing results network, and a willingness to intimidate competitors and extract payments. Court records, police memos, and histories agree on that much. The difference now was the scale of his bet and the brightness of the lights focused on it. He had traded quiet incomes in Los Angeles for a headline property in Nevada that could make him a public businessman or a very public failure. He knew the stakes. His partners knew them too. In the late afternoons, driving back from the desert on two-lane roads past Joshua trees and gas stations, he would lay out the math to friends in the car. There were thousands of returning servicemen, families with savings, a car culture growing by the month, and a nation ready to travel. If he could open a modern resort with top talent and perfect service, he would capture a new market. The casino would print money, the restaurants would sparkle, and the rooms would be booked months ahead. He spoke with certainty because certainty had carried him from a crowded Brooklyn street to a table by the window at the Brown Derby. Conviction was his engine. He still had Los Angeles to manage. Cohen held down the local operations, kept collectors honest, and handled disagreements that rose when bookmakers balked at fees. Those tensions sometimes led to vandalism and beatings, according to police files. None of it is celebrated here, or described in detail, only noted as part of the harm that ran beneath the elegance. Siegel spaced his visits between the city and the construction site, sleeping on trains, then in the Beverly Hills house where reporters occasionally staked out the curb, then back to Nevada, where the sun made everything look sharper and less forgiving. By 1946, the Flamingo had become more than a project. It was a test of his entire life story. He had chosen speed and power over patience and paperwork. Now he wanted all of that to produce something beautiful in public, something that would outlast him and justify the way he had won his money. Partners grew nervous as invoices piled up, and he grew more defensive. He still smiled for photos and stalked through hotel corridors with a tape measure. But he also snapped at questions and closed conversations the moment they drifted toward money. He pressed on. He had always pressed on. The boy from Brooklyn, who learned to take control of a street corner, now tried to control the look of a hotel lamp. It was the same impulse, stretched across a larger canvas. The desert waited, the palms were planted, the pink neon ordered. An opening date would soon be announced, and with it, a countdown that made every day feel heavier. The next stretch of this tale sits in that heat, a race against time, an opening intended to dazzle, an early stumble, and a second chance that almost worked. For now, he stands in the shell of a lobby, watching workers polish the floor, believing that once guests arrive, the past will fade, and the future will glow as brightly as the sign he has imagined since the first time he drove past that patch of sand. They tested the neon at dusk, a soft hum, and then a blush of pink along the curve of letters that would name a new chapter in the desert. Workers wiped dust from tile, trucks rumbled in with crates, and men in rolled-up sleeves argued about carpet seams while the sun sank behind the mountains. He paced through it all, jacket over his shoulder, pointing, counting, checking. He told anyone who would listen that a hotel could be a promise. If you made people feel important from the first step, they would forgive small things and remember only the glow. He believed it with a certainty that had carried him across a continent. The name had already taken hold. Even if the origin was a matter of rumor, Billy Wilkerson had chosen it back when the project was his. A sharp, modern word that suggested lightness and color. And Siegel kept it. People liked to say it came from Virginia Hill's long legs, as if she had named the place by walking through a doorway. Others rolled their eyes and said the story was made up to amuse columnists. Either way, the sign said Flamingo, and that word would soon be printed on matchbooks and postcards from coast to coast. He brought in Del Webb's construction company to tame the chaos. Webbing steel, plaster dust, last-minute orders. The site swarmed with tradesmen trying to meet a date that seemed to move like a mirage. Supplies were still scarce after the war, so materials had to be scavenged, redirected, or bought at a premium. He pushed suppliers hard. Bills grew. The budget, once a neat stack of guesses, became a mountain of numbers that made his investors squint. Where Wilkerson had once sketched a sleek roadside stop, Siegel insisted on a full resort with bungalows, a grand lobby, a pool, gardens, and a showroom fit for headliners. He wanted Miami style in Nevada Sunday. He had the ambition of a set designer and the impatience of a promoter. Opening night arrived on December 26, 1946. The casino floor gleamed, the bar was stocked, and reporters filed copy about a new era for the desert. Some stars came, drawn by curiosity and the chance to be seen. Others stayed in Los Angeles, the holiday timing and bad weather dulling the lure of a long drive. The big hitch was simple and stubborn. Many guest rooms were unfinished. You could attend the show, you could play at the tables, but you might have to sleep elsewhere. That is not the way to win over travelers in suits and gowns. The shows tried to lift the mood. Music filled the room, jokes landed, flashbulbs popped. The casino took in some money, but the margins didn't line up, and the press, always hungry for a stumble, noted the gap between the promise and the delivery. He called meetings before breakfast. He walked the grounds, stopped to run his hand across a banister, and told foremen that every day had to count double. He argued that once the rooms were ready, business would match the scale of his vision. He believed that in his bones. For a short time, though, the house took a beating. It was winter. The drive from Los Angeles felt longer when wind rattled the highway. Gamblers liked comfort, and comfort was not yet complete. After a few weeks of strain, he made the practical decision to shut down most operations and finish the job properly. The casino paused. Crews returned in force. The new target was a spring relaunch that would prove the critics wrong. While he fought that battle, the money story grew tense. Early estimates had placed the project around $1 million. Then two. Then more. By the time the first guests walked under the pink glow, widely reported figures had climbed beyond $6 million, an astonishing sum for a town that still felt like a railroad stop with neon. His backers back east, men he had known since the 20s, men who prized calm numbers over grand speeches, demanded clarity. He told them shortages had driven costs up, changes had added value, and every extra dollar would return 10 when the place hit its stride. Some nodded. Others tapped their fingers and traded doubtful looks. Whispers ran alongside the balance sheets. Investigators later claimed that money intended for construction left the country through Virginia Hill's bank accounts during a string of trips to Mexico and Europe. She denied siphoning funds, said she traveled for her own reasons, and kept her answers sparse. There was no neat ledger the public could read. What remained were open questions, and the simple truth that the cost had soared while the property was not yet stable. The dispute over what happened to every dollar would fuel arguments for years and color the way people told this story long after the key players were gone. In Los Angeles, the other half of his life kept tugging at his sleeve. The results network had to run on time. Bookmakers had to pay their fees, and rivals tested the edges. The city's underworld had been in flux through the early 1940s. Jack Dragna's older organization clashed with younger, flashier operators on the Sunset Strip. Mickey Cohen, Siegel's assertive lieutenant, fielded threats and answered them in kind, trying to protect revenue streams from raids and poachers. Newspapers labeled it a turf war. Police reports listed shootings and bombings. The details were ugly and harmed bystanders. None of that is repeated here. What matters to this telling is that Siegel's name sat atop an organization that drew money from illegal gambling and enforcement, and that pressure points in the city required attention, even as he tried to recast himself as a hotel man in Nevada. He shuffled between worlds. One morning he walked to Beverly Hills' dining room, pausing at tables, air-kissing friends of his girlfriend, smiling through gossip. That afternoon he drove to a downtown office where teletypes ticked out race results, listening to a manager explain why a switchboard had failed for 20 minutes and how many bookies had complained. The next day he was back in Nevada arguing about guest lists and kitchen layouts. He slept a few hours at a time, often on trains, and treated each arrival as if it were the start of a fresh act. He trusted his stamina and his charm, the two tools that had served him since boyhood. For the Flamingo's relaunch, he decided to drown the desert in attention. He hired a savvy publicist to pitch the hotel as a modern oasis, placed ads in Los Angeles papers, and called in favors with entertainers. He sent cars to meet certain guests at the state line, comped rooms for influential columnists, and made sure that every photograph captured the curve of neon, the palms, the pool, and the promise of ease. He wanted people to think of the Flamingo the way they thought of a premier studio lot or a famous restaurant, a place where a person could both relax and be seen. March 1, 1947, brought the second debut. This time the rooms were ready. The lobby shone. The staff had been drilled until every gesture looked practiced and effortless. Crowds lined up. Hollywood faces showed, smiling for the cameras, trading quips with MCs. Money clattered softly on felt. The cage filled. The night rolled forward with the smooth rhythm he had expected months earlier. Over the coming weeks, the trend turned. Revenues improved. Seats stayed warm. The casino booked steady wins, and the hotel sold out weekends. The press, which had grinned at his first misstep, now described a stylish retreat in the desert with a certain East Coast polish and a West Coast shine. He loved to walk the floor after midnight, hands in his pockets, tie a little loose, scanning the room. He knew the feel of a hot table and the slouch of a tired gambler. He stopped to greet couples, whispered a joke to a croupier, and moved along, always moving, always watching. He wanted calm order, smooth service, and a sense that the house, his house, was in control without being stiff. He tipped staff who handled problems gently and scolded anyone who broke the mood. He aimed for a hospitality standard that would make even skeptical observers admit that he had built something legitimate. None of that erased the ledger. Even as receipts improved, the question of total cost sat in the middle of every conversation with his partners. Some of those partners had begun sending their own trusted men to Las Vegas to watch the count. Mo Sedway, a longtime associate loyal to Meyer Lansky, and Gus Greenbaum, a seasoned operator from Phoenix, were asked to oversee the back office, trim excess, and report straight to the people who had supplied much of the cash. Their presence in Las Vegas signaled a change. It was as if a board of directors had dispatched auditors to a branch that spent past its plan. Siegel did not like the implication. He had given his talent and his face to the project. Now he felt watched in his own lobby. To be fair, Sedway and Greenbaum were not show ponies. They knew how to make a casino run without leaks, how to keep the drop safe, how to stack shifts so that fatigue didn't lead to errors, how to separate friends from freeloaders. If asked, they would have said they were saving the Flamingo from chaos and saving their investors from a write-off. If asked, he would have said they were preparing to steal his dream. That difference in viewpoint deepened every week as they tightened operations and pressed for direct control of cash handling. He tried to keep his balance by pointing to the numbers. He said the hotel was gaining speed, that a summer crowd would fill every room, and that a few months more would close the narrative about cost and mismanagement. He reminded anyone who challenged him that the resort belonged to a new class of travel, and that being first at that level mattered. He also threw himself into legitimate add-ons, planning a golf course across the highway for some future day, discussing partnerships for retail and fine dining, and looking at how to draw conventions. He talked like a Chamber of Commerce speaker, and a Broadway producer rolled into one. Still, the past refused to stay quiet. Grand juries in Los Angeles probed the race wire. Federal inquiry touched on gambling conspiracies that crossed state lines. His name appeared in stories about illegal machines seized in clubs and bribe cases whispered among officials. He dodged charges as he always had, through legal talent, lack of clean evidence, and the simple fact that many witnesses worried about testifying. The pattern exhausted him and made his backers nervous. Law enforcement attention meant business risk. Business risk made cautious men think about new management. He sought new allies in legitimate circles to counterbalance the pressure. He hosted charity events, donated to civic causes, and made sure that respectable faces were seen at the Flamingo on busy weekends. He booked acts that could draw not just gamblers but whole families, softening the hotel's image. A poolside photograph of a smiling couple in sunglasses helped more than 10 ads ever could. He understood the power of normalcy and used it when he could. Through it all, Virginia Hill stayed close. She loved speed, travel, and conversation that moved fast. She knew the players, could read a room in a glance, and enjoyed the attention and the freedom his world offered. Their fights were famous among friends, loud, dramatic, over in an instant, the makeup as theatrical as the argument. They were a pair built on heat and mutual advantage, complicated and public. She answered questions from police and reporters with a small shrug and cool eyes. She later told investigators that she had paid her own bills and owed no one an explanation. She was her own force, and she liked it that way. As spring turned to early summer, the Flamingo's numbers continued to climb. Articles began to speak of the hotel as a turning point for Las Vegas, a move from smoky rooms and cowboy decor to sleek lines and tailored service. Competitors took notes. Builders with different backers drew up plans for larger resorts. The town was changing in front of everyone, and no one could deny that Siegel had accelerated it. But praise did not silence skepticism among the men who had bankrolled the leap. They added the profits to the ledger and found the total still short of the promise. There is a moment in certain lives where momentum slows, and every handshake feels heavier than it used to. He reached that moment in the early months of 1947. He was still the man who could light a lobby, still the man who could make a host laugh and a guest feel welcome. He was also the man whose budget had exploded, whose partners had placed accountants at his elbow, and whose past kept ringing the phone. He sensed it. He told friends he needed a clean summer, that if the resort held its pace, everything would settle. He believed it because belief had worked before. He set his jaw and kept walking the floor. He met with Meyer Lansky in quiet settings, as he had for decades. The two men shared history deeper than any single deal. Lansky listened, asked precise questions, and spoke in short, careful bursts. He was not a man given to theater. He wanted order and steady returns. He told Siegel what the others were thinking, what patience remained, what lines could not be crossed. Loyalty and arithmetic sat across the table from each other. It is hard to please them both when money goes missing or arrives later than promised. In back rooms, partners reviewed options no one wanted to say aloud. Some urged patience. Others insisted that control had to be shifted to protect the investment. Those conversations were not unusual in business. They felt familiar to anyone who had ever owned a share of a risky venture and worried that the manager was in over his head. What made these talks different was the kind of partners involved and the way disagreements were sometimes settled in that world. That shadow darkened the edges of every meeting, even when the words were polite. He tried to make himself indispensable by sheer presence. He showed up for the staff at odd hours, helped a maitre de seat a cranky patron, stepped behind a bar to pour a drink when a line grew too long, and thanked dealers after a long shift. He knew that a well-run house needs a spirit, and he wanted the Flamingo's spirit to feel like him, confident, crisp, friendly, without being too familiar. Employees remembered him that way, demanding but attentive, hard on standards but quick with praise when things went right. The most honest truth of that season is simple. The hotel resort he envisioned did work. Guests loved it. The town learned from it. It made money in the spring, after the shaky winter, and it cost too much to build for the people who had paid the bills. Those facts can all sit together. They formed the tight box he could not escape. He had tried to jump from an illegal empire into legitimacy by building something beautiful. He had dragged old ways into that new project. The old ways did not travel well under bright lights. As June approached, he planned summer promotions, talked about outdoor concerts, and argued for patience one more time. The pool glittered in the sunday, the rooms were full. The neon script burned steady against the dark. In that light, he looked like a hotelier through and through, a man who had crossed a canyon and found purchase on the other side. But shadows do not care about appearances, and debts do not vanish because a lobby smells of gardenias. He could feel the distance growing between his voice and the men who signed the checks. In the day he walked the casino and the garden paths, in the night he called New York and Florida, smoothing the edges, explaining the numbers, promising that one good season would steady the ship. He had done this kind of dance his whole life, talking fast, then delivering just enough to keep confidence alive. The Flamingo made that routine harder. It was a house of glass, bright and public, and every budget fight behind the scenes seemed to echo down the corridors. He kept his tone even, never pleading, but the notes of strain began to creep in, as if time had lost its patience. He planned a summer promotion that would pull weekend crowds from the coast. Package deals for rooms and shows. A push to land bigger acts. Quiet outreach to travel writers who could turn a 3-paragraph item into a dozen inquiries. He rehearsed phrases meant for anxious partners. The spring returns. We're strong. The schedule of conventions looked promising. The dealers had found their rhythm. The cage was tight. He said it all with the conviction that had carried him since Brooklyn, and he believed it because he needed to. On a soft June night in Beverly Hills, he sat near a window in a quiet home that he used as a retreat, a place tied to his girlfriend but borrowed often as if it were his own. A newspaper lay across his lap. A friend was nearby. The neighborhood was still. What happened next was swift and left no room for second chances. Shots broke the calm from outside the glass. He was struck and died there in the room, the sound rolling out into a street where neighbors stepped onto porches and listened for another noise that never came. Police arrived, cordoned off the lawn, and gathered shell casings. Reporters learned quickly and rushed to the curb. The man who had tried to turn neon into a new kind of respect was gone at 41. The case remains officially unsolved. Detectives worked the phone lists, interviewed associates, and chased rumors across 3 states. Theories flared: a retaliation for cost overruns, a rival's move, a personal grudge, a decision made far from California in a room where money talked in cold sentences. None of the explanations ever hardened into a charge that stuck. The public settled for a narrative shaped by context. He had taken a large stake with men who expected discipline, and when the arithmetic embarrassed them, patience ran out. That idea has been repeated for decades with variations, always with the caveat that proof never found a courtroom. The immediate aftermath felt like a scene change choreographed in advance. In Las Vegas, 2 of his associates with deep ties to the investors Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum arrived at the Flamingo with authority. Staff saw new faces in the count room, new rules in the cage, new schedules for the drop. The label on the hotel stationery soon read with a flourish that matched the times: The Fabulous Flamingo. Under this management, the property found steady profits, benefited from tighter controls, and turned into the kind of engine its backers had wanted all along. The irony sits in plain sight. The vision he sold took flight, but without him. In Los Angeles, the balance of power shifted. Mickey Cohen, who had served as his street partner and protector of interests, moved fast to fill the space that opened the night the news hit the wires. He began to call the shots in his circles, fired back when tested, and became the face of a louder era in the city's underworld. Bombs and gunfire appeared in headlines as rivalries flared. Innocent people were put at risk by that chaos, a harm that cannot be softened by turning the page quickly. Enforcement stepped up raids, prosecutors assembled cases, and the glare that had followed Siegel now swung to Cohen. A few years later, tax indictments and prison time would catch up with that world too, part of a pattern that never truly changed. Easy money often meets a long memory in the law. Virginia Hill faced questions from every direction. Officers asked about travel, bank accounts, and cash flow during the months when the Flamingo's budget grew like a balloon. She kept her answers sparse, denied wrongdoing, and defended her independence. She was later drawn into national attention during the Senate hearings on organized crime at the start of the 1950s, where she sparred with questioners and gave the cameras a face for a story that had until then lived mostly in shadows and crime columns. Separate tax charges trailed her afterward. She left the country, spent years abroad, and became a figure discussed more for what others projected onto her than for anything she chose to say. Her connection to Siegel remained part of her public identity no matter where she went. Friends and family were left to sort memories. His ex-wife, who had long ago grown tired of the double life, focused on raising their daughters. Those daughters carried the weight of a last name known in every American city, learning to navigate a world where strangers felt entitled to ask intrusive questions. Old allies took stock. Some mourned quietly, some stayed silent in public, and spoke only in rooms where no one took notes. Meyer Lansky, ever reserved, said little on the record, and kept moving his pieces in a chess game that spanned decades and continents. The organization outlived one man and adjusted without a pause. That was by design. Back in Nevada, a wave began that would redefine an entire region. Before the Flamingo, there were roadside casinos like El Rancho Vegas and The Last Frontier, pioneering spots that drew travelers with stakes, stage shows, and the novelty of legal gaming. After the Flamingo, the tone changed. The Strip as a concept, sleek, themed, larger than life, gained a template. Soon came the Desert Inn, the Sands, the Sahara, and others, each chasing a blend of entertainment and comfort that Siegel had insisted the desert could carry. Credit belongs to many builders and financiers, and to the civic leaders who saw tourism as a path to growth. But the idea that luxury could thrive in that heat owes something to the standard he demanded. Law enforcement started to think differently too. The late 1940s and early 1950s brought national attention to gambling syndicates, the race wire, and the interstate flow of money. The Kefauver Committee hearings in 1950 and 1,951 broadcast testimony that pulled back curtains, at least a little, on relationships between casino floors, back-office loans, and big city bosses. Names associated with Siegel's world were read into the record, including managers who had taken over at the Flamingo. Nevada created stricter oversight over licenses, and later the state established the famous list that barred certain figures from casino properties. Control tightened, rules multiplied, and the business inched toward legitimacy, even as the stories of its early days lingered in the air like perfume. The argument over Siegel's legacy hardened into a set of familiar lines. Some writers cast him as the father of modern Las Vegas, a label that flatters and simplifies. It is more accurate to say he helped accelerate a turn already underway. He brought glamour, connected money to imagination, and lifted the ceiling on what a resort could look like. He did not invent the Strip. He did not build the town from nothing. He did make an imprint so sharp that later arrivals had to react to it, either by matching the elegance or by trying a different angle. In that sense, he played the role of a catalyst rather than a creator. The criminal record of his life, taken plain, is not ambiguous. He rose on protection schemes and bootlegging during Prohibition. He profited from illegal gambling, from the control of race results that fed bookmakers, and from extortion dressed as protection. He moved in the orbit of enforcement crews known for resolving disputes through fear and targeted killings. He was tried for a murder in Los Angeles and acquitted when key testimony fell apart. He faced other arrests tied to gambling and the wire, beating many charges but leaving a trail of reports and court files that outline the reach of his operations. None of this is offered as romance. It is part of the record, and it harmed people, directly and indirectly. At the same time, he carried traits that made him unusually compelling: a gift for presentation, a belief that style could open doors, and an instinct for recognizing where the culture was heading. He sensed that America, after the war, would want not just a gaming hall but a destination, not just a table but a setting that made the trip feel special. He took the shortcuts his training allowed: cash under the table, payoffs, pressure, and tried to bolt those to a legitimate facade. That bolt did not hold. The friction between old habits and new ambitions produced sparks that lit his name brighter than it might have been otherwise, and may have helped end his life. In Beverly Hills, the police case grew cold over time. They questioned drivers, phone operators, gardeners, cafe owners, and out-of-town visitors who had drifted through the city around the time of the attack. Theories pointed in different directions. An outside shooter recruited for the job, someone from within Los Angeles wanting to please higher-ups, or even a hothead moved by personal grievance rather than policy. The weapon used became a point of lore, debated in newspapers and later books, turning into a symbol for people more interested in trivia than in the larger questions. No arrest closed the file. The silence fits the pattern of that era. Crimes organized by people who valued distance between themselves, and the act often left only rumors behind. In Las Vegas, the Flamingo settled into its role. Guests arrived in bigger numbers each year. Showrooms booked up. The town learned how to sell sunshine in winter and neon at night. The properties multiplied. Deals were struck that put money from around the country under those chandeliers. Some of it came from organized figures, filtered through layers that kept names off licenses. Some came from businessmen who saw opportunity and took it without shame. The city practiced a kind of amnesty toward money as long as the shows dazzled and the books balanced. That approach would be challenged later by regulation and by the arrival of corporations. But in the decade after Siegel's death, it defined the rhythm of the Strip. Stories about him kept traveling. Magazine profiles painted him as a tragic modern figure, torn between rough origins and refined desires. Friends told soft tales about kindnesses, about gifts sent without signature, about loyalty shown when it mattered. Enemies described him as arrogant and wasteful. Journalists blended the accounts into a portrait that alternated between admiration and warning. Hollywood eventually made its own version, compressing and inventing as movies always do, giving him clever dialogue and a camera's affection. Films and novels turned him into a character who fit the city he loved. Sleek, dangerous, romantic, impossible to hold. There is a small garden at the Flamingo today where a marker notes his influence. Visitors walk by, snap photos, and move on to the next attraction. Some pause longer, thinking about a life that touched both crime blotters and travel brochures. The garden is quiet in the morning. Palms flicker, Water hums through a fountain, and for a moment it is easy to imagine him pleased with the order and the green lines. He wanted beauty and profit to live on the same page. The city he helped shape figured out how to do that more safely, more openly, with rules written down and numbers reviewed by auditors who send their reports to boards and regulators rather than to men in fedora hats. His daughters grew up. They made choices that had nothing to do with neon or newspapers. They lived with a name that started conversations before they said a word. People who loved him remembered small things. The way he straightened his tie in glass doors, how he held a pencil while adding figures, the exact tilt of his hat when he walked into a crowded room. Those details matter more in private than any headline. They humanize a figure whose public image tends to flatten into costume. When you look back across his life, a pattern emerges. He moved toward control of corners, of routes, of wires, of a hotel lobby. He trusted his will to bend circumstances to his plan. Many times he succeeded. The last time, the plan was bigger than his ability to keep every thread in hand. The money got louder than the charm. The people above him valued reliability more than dreams. When forced to choose between a return on investment and a friend's persuasion, they picked the former. It is a cold equation, and in his world, cold equations were enforced in hard ways. If there is a lesson tucked into this midnight telling, it might be this. Ambition without boundaries can build grand rooms and also open doors that cannot be closed. The Flamingo proved the power of imagination in a place that many dismissed as a dusty dot on a map. His death proved that a past built on fear has a way of collecting dues. Neither cancels the other. Both belong to the story. The day after the news spread, the casino did not close. Chips still slid across felt, a band still warmed up in the showroom, and the kitchen still set out plates as if routine could steady the air. In Las Vegas, momentum is its own language. Managers gathered in back offices, counted bills, and agreed to keep the doors open. Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum moved into key chairs, not with speeches but with lists. Staffing changes, expense caps, new cage procedures, a tighter eye on complementary rooms. They added structure where the project had run on willpower. The hotel's letterhead soon switched to the fabulous Flamingo, an echo of a fresh start that still kept the look he had demanded. Guests noticed the polish more than the politics. The rooms felt calm, the pool shone, and the showroom built a steady calendar. The dream was now a business tuned for reliability. Word traveled quickly back east that the property was no longer a gamble. Profits rose, and investors who had frowned at the cost now nodded at the returns. The Flamingo gained neighbors in spirit, if not yet in distance. New developers studied the template. The Desert Inn opened in 1950 with a golf course and a crisp tone, led on paper by Wilbur Clark, but backed by men from Cleveland circles like Mo Dalitz. The Sands arrived in 1952 with a showroom that made stars feel at home. The Sahara and the Riviera followed. Each property tried a different accent. Moroccan edges, mid-century modern lines, showrooms designed for orchestras and comedians. The city was evolving at a pace that would have pleased the man who had argued for elegance in the desert. Change on the Strip was matched by change in Los Angeles. Mickey Cohen stepped into the space left behind and spoke louder than his old boss ever had. He liked attention. He liked headlines. He liked to signal strength. That approach drew counterpressure. Jack Dragna, the older figure who preferred quiet control, did not vanish. The two rubbed against each other's plans, and sparks flew. Police records from the late 1940s through the early 1950s list a string of bombings and drive-by attacks as parts of the city's underworld tried to redraw the map. Innocent people were put at risk by that chaos, an outcome that underlined the cost of those feuds. The state responded with raids, arrests, and, eventually, tax cases that clipped wings. The mood of Los Angeles shifted from dazzled curiosity to tired wariness. Restaurants tightened guest lists. Studios learned to keep a careful distance. In Chicago and other hubs, the racing results service that had made money for so many bookmakers turned another corner. Years earlier, Mo Annenberg's National News Service had fallen under tax charges. After his conviction, James Roggen's Continental Press rose in influence. And after Rogan died in the late 1940s, the network settled under a different kind of management, with the outfit in Chicago taking a leading role. Lines that once crackled in small offices now moved under tighter control. On the West Coast, replacements for the old rooms were installed in quieter spaces, and local distribution in California stayed a contested, profitable niche until federal attention turned up the heat again. Those federal eyes arrived in full glare during the Kefauver Committee hearings of 1950 and 1951. Televised sessions pulled in millions of viewers. Names from a dozen cities appeared under bright lights. Senators asked about the wire, casino financing, payoffs, and the way money crossed state lines to shape local decisions. Virginia Hill sat at a table facing the dais and answered questions about travel, deposits, and her years with Benjamin Siegel. She was poised, guarded, sometimes wry, and she refused to accept the frame painted around her by rumor. The public saw her as a person for the first time, rather than as a shadow in a gossip column. She later faced tax charges of her own and left the country to live in Europe, where she kept her distance from the mythology that followed her. The hearings did not end organized crime, but they changed the conversation. Nevada tightened its licensing process, built enforcement around a new state framework, and later created the list that could bar certain people from stepping onto a casino floor. By the mid-1950s, the state had a control board. In 1959, lawmakers passed the Gaming Control Act and set up the Nevada Gaming Commission. With those steps came audits, public hearings, and a slow shift towards something that looked less like a private club and more like a regulated industry. This did not erase every backroom practice of the era. It narrowed the lane for them and invited future corporate owners to consider a place they had once avoided. The Flamingo adjusted with the times. Managers replaced the original showroom and added new wings. Ownerships shifted in ways common to hotels that need fresh capital. The property kept the name because the name had become a brand. Ads in travel magazines showed smiling couples at the pool, cool drinks on small tables, and lines promising an escape that felt within reach. The tone leaned less on whispers and more on star power. The Sands became famous for its lounge acts. The Flamingo leaned into elegance and comfort, a style that matched the city's new pitch. Come for a few days, relax, see a show, and head home with a story that does not make your boss raise an eyebrow. In these years, friends of Benjamin Siegel built their own paths. George Raft's film career wavered and then settled into nightclub hosting and casino promotions. He had backed Siegel publicly and paid a price for that loyalty and lost roles. Meyer Lansky expanded his interests with a quiet discipline that kept him free for decades. He invested through partners, kept detailed ledgers, and judged managers by their ability to deliver steady results. Mickey Cohen, after a wild stretch of public feuds, eventually met his match in tax cases that sent him to federal prison. The pattern held. Those who wanted the spotlight often faced it in courtrooms. Those who preferred clean margins and clean suits tended to last longer. Writers and reporters mapped Siegel's life onto larger arcs. They put him on a timeline that ran from Ellis Island neighborhoods to national syndicates, from Manhattan speakeasies to Hollywood parties, from backroom enforcement to a modernist resort with a pink script on the sign. They pointed to his crimes plainly: protection rackets aimed at small businesses in his early days, bootlegging during Prohibition, hijacking operations that stole other people's cargo, illegal gambling rooms that skirted every rule on the books, control over the transmission of horse racing results that gave his circle leverage over bookmakers, and efforts to shape unions for profit. They noted the Greenberg case and his acquittal. They listed arrests tied to gambling and the wire. They discussed his partnerships with men whose reputations were tied to enforcement crews that carried out murders on behalf of the syndicate. These were not invented after the fact. They are part of the record, and they show a pattern of conduct that harmed others. Those same accounts also mark the moments when he aimed at legitimacy. He wanted the Flamingo to stand as proof that a person could change his lane without changing his stride. He invested in a downtown Las Vegas casino before the big move, sold when the heat rose, and then bet everything on a property he believed could change an entire town's destiny. He courted entertainers, studied floor plans, and demanded excellence from stonemasons and waiters alike. He learned about kitchen flows and guest services, as if he had trained in hotels rather than on street corners. The contradiction between his means and his goal gives his story its lasting pull. It is the push and pull between past and future that keeps his name hovering over conversations about the history of the Strip. Families who lost out to his rackets did not care about his hotel dreams. Shopkeepers shaken down in the 1920s cared about the cash taken from their drawers, not about a neon idea 20 years later. Competitors forced to pay fees to use the results wire did not admire his taste in lobby lamps. That contrast matters. When people tell his story as a tale of glamour, it is essential to include the cost paid by others along the way. Success measured in chandeliers should be weighed against harm measured in fear. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Las Vegas entered another stage. Corporate money began to mix with older sources. Banks grew more comfortable with the city. Unions invested through pension funds. Hotel towers climbed. Performers made residencies that became legend. The town leaned into conventions and set up halls that could seat thousands. In 1961, the Federal Wire Act targeted interstate bookmaking communications, another sign that the old racing results network was now a legal hazard rather than a quiet advantage. The culture around gambling changed from backroom whispers to front-of-house entertainment. Under it all, auditors sharpened pencils and looked for steady returns where once only cash counts had stood. As the town changed, the myth around Siegel hardened into a few repeated frames. There was the young man in a sharp suit in 1930s New York, completely at ease in nightclubs. There was the visitor to Hollywood, charming rooms full of stars. There was the defendant in a Los Angeles courtroom, photographed from the side as if a different angle could change the verdict. There was the builder in the desert, frowning at a piece of tile, imagining a perfect finish that the budget could not bear. There was the man in a quiet Beverly Hills house at the end of his run. These images fit together like a collage that invites both admiration and caution. He is both the kid who wanted out of a tenement and the adult who chose a path that put other people in fear. His children carried on with lives far from press lines. Friends kept their memories clean or let them blur on purpose. Actors and directors borrowed pieces of him for roles. Journalists kept circling back. Every few years, a new book would revisit the question that had no settled answer. Who ordered the attack in Beverly Hills, and why? Theories multiply because the lack of an official solution invites imagination. The simplest explanation remains the one most often whispered. The flamingo cost too much. Questions about missing funds would not die, and replacing him looked safer to men who had money at stake. It is a cold calculus, and it reflects the rules of the world he chose for himself. It is worth noting one more strand that followed him into legend: his dislike of the nickname that the press loved. He preferred Benjamin or Ben. He wanted dignity in a public that leaned toward caricature. The nickname stuck anyway because it made headlines and fit a story people thought they understood. In that sense, he lost control of his own name, just as he lost control of the hotel he built. The gap between who we want to be and how the world talks about us can be large. For public figures, that gap is an ocean. Decades after his death, you can still walk through the Flamingo's grounds and feel a trace of the original promise. The property has been rebuilt, rebranded, and refreshed more than once. Styles changed, and then changed again. The path by the water is lined with palms. Visitors take pictures near a small plaque that mentions him by his full name. Some stop long enough to read dates. Some simply nod at the memory and drift toward the next show. None of the guests owe him a thought, and yet the idea he chased sits under their steps. A resort in the desert now feels ordinary because men and women before them insisted that it could be done. He was one of those voices, insistent to the end. If you push past the myths and look at the ledger, the shape of his life is clear. He made money through illegal enterprises for most of his career. He cultivated alliances that protected those businesses. He used charm, pressure, and, when needed, the threat of force to secure his aims. He stood trial for a murder tied to internal disputes and walked free when key testimony collapsed. He moved west to expand the wire and to hide in plain sight among stars. He invested in clubs and backroom games. He tried to convert that momentum into something legal and refined. He succeeded in the building. He failed in the balance with his backers. The organization that had lifted him chose to move on without him. That choice ended his life and secured his legend. For all the focus on a single man, the more lasting story may be about a country learning to turn wild hustles into regulated industries. Las Vegas is the proof. It began as a small stop with rough edges, grew into a bright stage for risk, and then matured into a vacation city with corporate ownership and a rulebook. In the handoff from private syndicates to public companies, the lessons learned in the early years mattered. Efficiency mattered, presentation mattered, guest experience mattered. He understood those things early. Others refined them and collected the rewards. There is no neat moral at the end, only a set of truths that can sit side by side. He could be warm with friends and cold with rivals. He supported a family and also built fear into neighborhoods. He brought polish to a dusty town and caused harm in the way he gathered capital. He wanted his name cleaned by a project that dazzled the eye, and he left behind a crime record that cannot be wiped away by garden paths or good lighting. The best way to tell his story is to keep all of it visible and let the listener hold the weight. The cameras came later, turning him into a silhouette that could be pulled off a shelf whenever a writer needed a sharp hat and a sharper smile. In the years after his death, films and books stitched scenes together. Some pulled from court files, some lifted from gossip, some invented to fill spaces no one could verify. Viewers saw a man framed in soft light beside a pool, heard him deliver lines that sounded like destiny, and watched him stare at neon, as if he could will it brighter. The picture was compelling because a real story sat under it. A kid from Brooklyn who built a life through illegal trades, then tried to turn that momentum into a place where music floated over palms. The gap between the man and the myth is where memory still lingers. If you ask people who knew him, the answers come in tones colored by their roles. A dealer at the Flamingo might remember him adjusting a tie clip on the way past, a small ritual that signaled his demand for polish. A bookmaker from downtown Los Angeles might recall a different man entirely, the one whose associates collected fees and checked compliance in ways that did not leave bruises on paper. A film star from those evenings on the Strip would talk about charm, easy jokes, and the feeling that you were standing near a person who knew how to arrange a room. A detective might lean back and list dates and raids. They talked about the same life from different seats. The public record remained steady on the key facts. He profited from protection schemes in his teens and 20s, shaking down pushcarts and storefronts with Lansky and a tight crew. He made money during Prohibition moving liquor and guarding cargo, sometimes hijacking trucks carrying contraband for others. He worked for and alongside men who were reorganizing the underworld into a national network, pairing diplomacy with force to settle disputes. He associated with figures linked to enforcement teams that carried out targeted killings for hire. When Prohibition ended, he shifted toward illegal gambling, the control of horse racing results for bookmakers, and other rackets that turned on information and intimidation. In Los Angeles, he invested in clubs, controlled access to the racing wire, and used a mix of persuasion and pressure to hold market share. Those actions harmed people and businesses. They are not softened by the later hotel. There were moments outside that pattern that complicate his portrait. In the late 1930s, in the company of the Countess Dorothy di Frasso, he traveled in Europe and explored ventures that were unusual for a man known for nightclubs and wire rooms. Reports from friends suggest he met high-ranking officials in Italy and tried to broker deals tied to munitions or industrial goods. The accounts do not line up cleanly. Some say grand introductions led nowhere. Others claim he was rebuffed when the talk turned to contracts. Either way, he returned to California with a taste for continental style and a renewed belief that a grand hotel could be a stage where he could play the businessman convincingly. Another strand often mentioned in hushed tones is his stance toward domestic hate groups in the 1930s. Some histories describe him joining other young Jewish men in New York who disrupted rallies held by pro-Nazi organizers. They broke up meetings with speed and a determination that those voices would not parade unopposed in their neighborhoods. Those acts were violent and unsanctioned, a response to a hateful moment that tested the limits of patience. They sit oddly next to his other crimes, evidence of a conscience that reacted fiercely to a specific threat, even as he continued to profit from activities that hurt people in different ways. In Hollywood, he aligned himself with men who understood both unions and studios. Johnny Rosselli, a smooth operative tied to Chicago, helped arrange a broad scheme that demanded payments from producers in exchange for labor peace. Those cases exploded in the early 1940s when Willie Byoff and George Brown were indicted and convicted for extorting Hollywood through union power. Rosselli went to prison later. Siegel, who moved in that orbit and enjoyed the company of stars, avoided indictment on those particular charges. The overlap in relationships reinforced his image as a broker who could translate between worlds, equally at ease with a producer in a tuxedo and a bookmaker counting a day's take in a back office. Law enforcement followed him across the years with a persistence that hardened into routine. Arrests tied to gambling rooms, evidence seized in wire service raids, questions about cash flows, and interviews prompted by assaults on rivals-filled file folders in Los Angeles and beyond. The Greenberg murder case was the most dramatic encounter, ending with a not guilty verdict after key testimony never reached the stand. Tax agents watched him, and papers occasionally predicted a case that never came. He was disciplined about paperwork in his personal accounts, used buffers to keep distance from cash, and let his public persona do work that a ledger could not. When his name appeared in a headline, he arranged a night out with allies in the film community, smiling for columnists who loved a good quote. The shadow of the flamingo covers the later decades like a long sunset. After his death, the property under Sedway and Greenbaum demonstrated what he had promised: consistent profits, smooth service, streamlined operations, and a brand that could pull travelers off a highway from hundreds of miles away. That success was repeated up and down the Strip. The Sands built a legend around its showroom and lounge acts. The Desert Inn sold golf and tranquility. The Sahara leaned into themed glamour, and downtown kept its own energy with Fremont Street lights. By the late 1950s, conventions became a pillar. Men and women arrived for business meetings and stayed for shows. The orbit of Las Vegas widened. National attention changed the framework. The Kefauver hearings forced Americans to look at organized crime as something structured rather than theatrical. Viewers saw senators ask simple questions and watch witnesses dodge. They saw Virginia Hill push back, refusing to let others define her entirely through her relationships. They heard names tied to the gaming industry, the race wire, and the flow of money that linked big cities to the desert. The hearings did not end any of it, but they made regulators bolder and gave cover to local officials in Nevada who wanted the industry to clean up enough to welcome new investors. The next waves reshaped ownership. The 1960 Black Book identified people excluded from casinos, a public list that signaled the state's willingness to draw lines. Corporate attitudes shifted. Banks extended credit. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, administered out of the Midwest, supplied loans that funded expansion and new builds, sometimes alongside traditional money. In 1966 and 1967, Howard Hughes purchased several properties, bringing a famous name and a new level of institutional seriousness. By the 1970s and 1980s, large companies traded casino shares on stock exchanges. Auditors roamed where once only countroom managers had stood, and federal laws targeted interstate communications and money laundering with sharper teeth. The business changed complexion while holding on to the basic proposition that had lured Siegel to the sand. People will travel for a complete experience if you make them feel cared for. Through those transformations, his name remained a fixture in history sections, magazine features, and film scripts. Writers leaned on a few core scenes: the early street hustles with Meyer Lansky, the dangerous glamour of New York's reforming underworld, the move to Los Angeles under pressure, the friendships with stars, the trial, the neon dream, and the final night in Beverly Hills. Each retelling chose a tone: cautionary, celebratory, tragic, or analytical. Some accounts exaggerated his role in the founding of Las Vegas to the point of myth. Others pushed back, pointing to developers and operators who had built successful highway resorts before the Flamingo, and to the many hands that turned a small town into an international destination. Family stories made a softer counterweight to the headlines. His daughters spoke about a father who showed up at school events when he could, who cared about appearances because he believed first impressions opened doors, and who tried to keep the worst parts of his work life away from the dinner table. Friends from childhood remembered a boy who could make you laugh and then talk you into a plan you hadn't known you wanted. People who worked for him at the Flamingo remembered pride in a job well done, a tray held level, a table settled before a guest even knew they needed help. Those memories do not erase what he did. They round him out enough that the figure on the plaque feels like someone who once took a breath and worried about his choices. When you trace his crimes across the map, you see growth and specialization. Protection money from small shops in the 1920s turned into the control of supply lines for bootleg liquor. Hijacking operations aimed at competitors' trucks merged into coordinated enforcement on behalf of a syndicate that prized profit over street corner pride. After Prohibition, he stayed with gambling because it combined his skill at reading people with a sensitivity to numbers and timing. The Racing Results Service gave him leverage over bookmakers because every delay had a price. In Los Angeles, he paired that leverage with investments in clubs and backroom games, building a portfolio that fed cash into a larger network. Around it all sat the threat of punishment for those who defied the structure. He relied on allies for the roughest tasks, keeping his own hands away from scenes that drew police. The Flamingo was an attempt to keep the presentation and abandon the shadow. He could not escape the habits that had delivered his earlier success. He also could not step away from the expectations of men who measured trust in dollars and days. When the budget at the Flamingo swelled beyond the promised numbers, trust thinned. Rumors about money that slipped out through side doors, whether true or exaggerated, fed an impatience that had a tradition of hard endings. The decision that ended his life has never been solved in court. That gap leaves space for speculation. The most straightforward reading remains about finance and pride rather than romance or personal feud. A project ran long and ran hot, and a group known for closing ranks decided to do so in a quiet room far from a scaffold. Afterward, the city he had chosen as his stage carried on. Las Vegas learned to speak in superlatives and to upgrade constantly. New resorts replaced old ones. Towers rose. Showrooms evolved from big band platforms to pop stages with video walls. The Strip moved south and expanded, then reinvented itself again and again to court new generations. What stayed from his time was the insistence on polish, the idea that service could be part of the show, and the conviction that a hotel can sell a feeling as powerfully as it sells a room. The rest, the fear, the shortcuts, the whispering, was pushed to the edges by regulation and badge-carrying officers who finally had the tools to cleanly ask for the books. In quieter corners, a different set of legacies unfolded. The businesses he had squeezed in the 1920s were long gone, but the memory of intimidation lived on in families that passed down stories of a grandfather whose shop paid for protection, or a relative who lost a route to a crew that moved faster and hit harder. The thread from those lives to a pink sign in Nevada is not always visible in tourist brochures. It belongs in any complete telling. He was both builder and breaker. He is remembered because of the hotel. He should also be remembered because of the pressure he put on neighborhoods before the hotel ever existed. The cultural figure that bears his name now acts as a kind of shorthand. In books and screenplays, Bugsy signals a blend of elegance and danger, quick wit and quick temper, generosity for friends and cold calculation for adversaries. He hated the nickname while alive. It flattened him into caricature. It won anyway because it fit headline space and stayed in the ear. In a way, the nickname reflects the same lesson as the hotel. You can influence the story, you can spend money on lighting and paint, but the things other people choose to repeat in rooms you never enter will outlast your careful version. Some visitors to that garden at the Flamingo read the plaque and decide to give him more credit than the facts support. Others dismiss him as a violent man who happened to like nice furniture. The most accurate place to stand is in the middle. He spotted what Las Vegas could become and pushed it forward by force of personality, borrowed money, and a love of surfaces. He also ran rackets that exploited people and broke the law for years. His hotel survives in one form or another. The organization that funded him survived him. His daughters outlived the columns and carried their own stories. The city he helped catalyze learned to greet the world with a smile you can see from space. If you pull back far enough, the outline of a common American tale appears. A child of immigrants finds a way to climb, rejects the slow path for a faster one, collects power, and then tries to turn that power into something respectable before the bill comes due. Many people in many fields have followed a gentler version of that arc. He chose a road that damaged those along the way and placed himself in a circle that enforced accountability without courts. That is why people still whisper about him in lobbies and write about him when the lights go down. Night settles easily when you start to gather the loose threads. The names said in side rooms, the deals struck with a nod, the debts that outlived the men who made them. To understand Benjamin Siegel without myth, you follow the lines back to the early web that held him. Friendships, rivalries, and a new kind of order that tried to turn gang wars into balance sheets. He met Meyer Lansky as a ragged teenager, and the partnership never really broke. Lansky thought like an accountant who loved chess. Siegel moved like a producer who loved an audience. They started small, pushing protection on shopkeepers and peddlers, a wrong that brought money and resentment in equal measure. The crew's reputation grew because they were quick, loyal to each other, and ready to do hard things that others hesitated to try. Prohibition raised the stakes. With liquor banned, supply lines became gold. They guarded trucks, ran speakeasies, and hijacked competitors. Cash flowed. Violence shadowed it. None of that is offered as thrill. It is the plain background of his rise. By the late 1920s, the Italian underworld in New York was tearing itself apart. The Castellamarese War pitted old bosses against younger leaders. When it ended in 1931, Lucky Luciano, with Frank Costello at his shoulder and allies like Lansky in the room, reorganized things into a national structure. Journalists later called it the Commission. Prosecutors and historians reached for the term National Crime Syndicate to describe the wider alliance that included Jewish and Italian crews, and others who agreed on this. Profits first, feuds last, and rules simple enough to keep money moving. Siegel's role there was not top-tier leadership, but he had access. He could sit in meetings where territories were mapped and disputes settled. Accounts written long after the fact place him near the plotting that ended the war. Some even claim he helped with the move against Salvatore Maranzano, where gunmen posed as officers to gain entry. The details are contested and likely will always be. What is clear is his closeness to the new order and the rise in his standing as it took hold. The enforcement arm that the press later named Murder Incorporated grew out of this order, a solution for those moments when a contract had to be enforced the hard way. The names attached to it, Louis Lepke Buchalter, Albert Anastasia, and an array of tough men from Brownsville and elsewhere, spoke to a system that preferred to keep its boardroom clean by outsourcing its darkest tasks. Siegel moved in those circles. He knew the players and shared ventures with them. Later, when Abe Reles turned government witness, he tied many figures to specific killings, and then he died in 1941 under police protection, after a fall from a hotel window that became a symbol for cases that never reached trial. That loss of testimony rippled across several prosecutions, including the one in Los Angeles that had Siegel's name at the center. His personal life linked him even tighter to that world. In 1929, he married Esta, whose maiden name Krakauer matched that of an associate in his circle. They had 2 daughters, Millicent and Barbara. He could be attentive and proud at home, a father who wanted good schools and nice things placed just so. He also kept long hours and secrets, an absence that hardened into separation. The split between the man setting a breakfast table and the man settling accounts after midnight tells you as much about him as any balance sheet. He never liked the nickname Bugsy. It suggested recklessness. It made light of control. He preferred Ben. He corrected friends who slipped and bristled at columnists who used it with a wink. That small irritation grew as his public profile did. The name stuck because headlines liked it, and the public loves rhythm. In a way, the nickname turned into a warning. Once a story chooses a mask for you, pulling it off takes more strength than most people have. A different kind of fight in the 1930s briefly united hard men with a cause beyond profit. As pro-Nazi groups tried to hold rallies in American cities, stories from that time describe Siegel and other Jewish toughs, including Lansky, showing up to break meetings apart and send a message that those uniforms and armbands would not parade unchallenged in their neighborhoods. Those clashes were illegal and violent, yet they were aimed at a particular form of hate that many could not stomach. They sit uneasily alongside the rest of his record. They also remind you that people can be contradictory without becoming fictional. Hollywood fit him like a tailored jacket. He was friends with George Raft, who had come from a similar background and understood both film sets and nightclubs. He was linked romantically to actress Wendy Berry for a stretch, a pairing that fed gossip columns and gave him a sheen of studio glamour. Producers liked him because he made rooms feel safe with his presence, even if the safety he promised drew from the same pressure he used on bookmakers. He moved between Ciro's, the Trocadero, and the Brown Derby as if he held shares in the laughter. He knew Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons would mention his name if he sat at the right table at the right hour. He treated visibility like currency. Behind the glow, he kept building the business that paid the bills. The race wire. In an age before television, bookmakers lived or died by the speed of horse racing results. The wire service connected tracks to cities through leased lines and teletype machines. If you controlled access, you could charge for it, lean on rivals, and deny your enemies the seconds that decide the day's outcome. On the West Coast, Siegel helped bring that network under his influence, aligning with out-of-state services and making sure local distribution bent to his will. Some operators came along willingly because the service ran smoothly under his watch. Others needed persuasion. Police raided wire rooms, seized machines, and took operators in for questioning. Arrests landed, many cases dissolved. The pattern repeated for years: disruption, repair, profit, and the steady grind of legal pressure. Another strand through those years tied organized crime to organized labor in Hollywood. Johnny Rosselli, connected to Chicago's outfit, became a bridge between studios and unions. The scandal centered on Willie Beoff and George Brown, who extorted producers for labor peace and went to prison for it. Rosselli served time later. Siegel mixed in those circles close to the action without becoming the headline defendant in that particular case. The overlap worked in his favor. He could smooth things for a producer on Tuesday and sit with bookmakers on Wednesday, and both groups would nod when he entered the room. He traveled too. With Countess Dorothy DeFrasso, he crossed the Atlantic, tried to dress his ambition in European manners, and reportedly explored deals that had the whiff of arms or industrial supply about them. Whether those conversations were serious or show is hard to pin down from this distance. What matters is the effect on him. He returned convinced that a hotel could feel continental in the middle of an American desert, and that people would pay to feel that way for a weekend. That belief powered everything he did in Nevada. When he and his partners briefly bought into the El Cortez in downtown Las Vegas, they tested the market, learned how local licenses worked, and then sold under pressure when law enforcement studied the ownership list with a squint. The sale turned a profit and taught a lesson. The town would take their money but not their names without friction. The Flamingo, born first in Billy Wilkerson's notebooks, offered a different route. Bring money, add scale, smile for the newspaper, and propose a level of polish that made everyone forget who signed the checks. It almost worked. The Flamingo's cost ballooned. He insisted on finishes and fittings that were hard to buy just after the war. He fired contractors who disappointed him, rehired others when deadlines slipped, and rewrote plans midstream. The first opening landed poorly. The relaunch worked. Receipts rose. But the gap between cost and calm returns spooked his investors. Stories about money moved by Virginia Hill during that period remain part of the lore. Trips to Mexico and Europe, deposits that prosecutors later described as siphoned funds. She rejected the accusations. The paper trail was thin because people in their world preferred it that way. What is certain is that finances got loud enough to drown out his charm in the rooms that mattered. The Havana Conference of 1946 sits like a short chapter with long echoes. Lucky Luciano, deported to Italy, slipped into Cuba. Lansky helped arrange a gathering at the Hotel Nacional. Bosses from around the United States gathered to talk gambling, narcotics, and the future. Performers entertained. Reporters sniffed around. Lists of attendees vary, but many accounts place Siegel in the mix, pitching his desert project and asking for patience. Weeks later, U.S. pressure on the Cuban government sent Luciano back to Italy. Whether or not Siegel shook hands on an exact sum there, the meeting confirms how closely linked the desert venture was to a national web of money and expectations. Law enforcement never stopped asking questions. In New York, Thomas Dewey had shown in the 1930s that careful prosecution could take down powerful figures. In Los Angeles, district attorneys tried to do the same with gambling and wire cases, notching occasional wins and many frustrating losses. The Greenberg murder case drew the most eyes and left the strangest trail. Witnesses turned, an informant died, and an acquittal closed the file without cleaning the stain of suspicion. He emerged free and more famous, a pattern that made cops furious and partners proud. His story touches the edges of government work in a way that invites speculation but not certainty. During World War II, naval intelligence leaned on Luciano's influence to secure New York docks against sabotage, a cooperation sometimes called Operation Underworld. Lansky helped make the introductions and managed contacts. Did Siegel play a direct role? Records do not put him in the middle of that effort. What the episode reveals is the porous border between official needs and unofficial networks in moments of crisis. The same men who had corrupted parts of the waterfront could, when asked, help secure it. That paradox sits in the same file drawer as every other contradiction in this story. The Beverly Hills attack ended his life and began a second life on paper. Theories piled up in the absence of a conviction. An order from men furious about Flamingo overruns, a rival's ambition, a personal grudge dressed as policy. The unsolved nature of the case keeps the storytelling alive. The simplest explanation remains rooted in money and discipline. In a world that prized steady returns, someone decided he had become a liability no speech could fix. Afterward, the Flamingo ran the way his backers wanted it to run by the book they preferred. Sedway and Greenbaum brought in stricter controls, and the property delivered. The town changed its pitch from rough novelty to curated escape. The Strip grew. The law evolved. The Wire Act of 1961 targeted the kind of interstate betting communications that had been central to his income 20 years earlier. Nevada's regulators matured into bodies that could say yes or no in daylight. Corporate ownership replaced backroom loans as the dominant source of capital. The thing he wanted to be remembered as a builder came true in part because the town kept the elegance and pushed the rest away with rules. Memory kept the old pieces in circulation. Magazine features returned to his name at predictable anniversaries. Films gave him witty dialogue, a tender glance, and a tragic arc that fit Hollywood better than any rap sheet could. Biographers argued over how much credit he deserved for Las Vegas. Some gave him too much, others erased him too quickly. A fair reading sits between those extremes. He was not the father of the Strip, but he was a catalyst who accelerated its move toward polish and scale. He also carried a record of crimes that cannot be sidestepped when telling that truth. If you listen long enough to people who were children when he was alive, you hear small, precise memories that resist myth. A daughter watching her father smooth a tablecloth. A worker remembering the way he checked corners for dust. A friend smiling at the thought of him correcting a mispronounced name without making the person feel small. Those touches sit beside harder memories held by others. Fear when collections came due. Phones that stopped working when the wires managers wanted leverage. A storefront that paid a fee because not paying felt dangerous. Both sets of memories belong to the same man. He was never a one-city story. New York gave him his start, with Brownsville grit and the hurly-burly of a gangland reorganization. Los Angeles taught him how to wear charm like a suit and pull money from information. Las Vegas gave him a chance to turn that into a public edifice. Havana gave him a room where the national web met under chandeliers. Miami, Chicago, Cleveland, Phoenix, and other places supplied pieces and people. Each city added a layer to the picture, until the picture looked less like a portrait and more like a map. As the decades rolled on, some of his closest contemporaries met ends that rhymed with his. Albert Anastasia was shot in a barber chair in 1957, a famous photograph afterward making the rounds without the gore in our telling here. Lepke Buchalter went to the electric chair after conviction, a sign that prosecutors could, in time, reach even insulated figures. Frank Costello survived an attempt on his life and retired into quiet influence. Lansky outlasted many, always counting, always cautious, always ready to move when heat grew. The lesson their fates suggest is one he learned too late. The house rarely lets you cash out on your own terms. If you walk the Strip now, the air feels like a permanent holiday. The showrooms have screens the size of billboards. The food tastes better than anyone in the 1940s could have imagined. The machines hum in every tone of a rainbow. Under the surface, audits run. Regulators read ledgers, and compliance teams check boxes. That infrastructure exists to prevent a man like Benjamin Siegel from ever again holding the kind of quiet power he held for a time. You can still feel echoes in the insistence on service, in the belief that a lobby can set a mood that lingers for years, but the world has shifted enough that the old mix of charm and pressure has no legal place to stand. The echoes lasted longer than the headlines. Courtrooms in other cities still said his name as cases unfolded that touched the wire service, union skims, or old agreements. Detectives used his story in briefings as a way to explain how a local racket could plug into a national system. Writers clipped his picture for magazine spreads that promised revelations and mostly retold what was already known. Each reappearance reminded people that one man's rise could be a map of an era. Small hustles, bigger circles, a public dream, and a sudden end that never found a docket number to match it. His funeral came quickly, quiet by design. Family led the way. Old friends from the neighborhood kept their distance or slipped in without remark. He was laid to rest at Hollywood Forever, in the Beth Olam Mausoleum, far from the desert where his last gamble stood. There were flowers, and a few short eulogies that spoke to the boy before the suits and the papers. Outside, reporters waited for a comment that never came. The people who might have offered it had learned long ago that silence outlives clever quotes. Life around him rearranged itself. Esta focused on her daughters and built a private world where school and birthdays mattered more than any column. Friends made choices that pulled them toward safety or, in some cases, further into the business that had fed them for years. Virginia Hill answered questions for investigators, sat at a Senate table under hard lights, traveled, fought tax cases, left the country, and tried to outlast a label she had never chosen. Mickey Cohen filled the space in Los Angeles with volume and spectacle, then met the inevitability of a tax case and federal time. Meyer Lansky stayed steady, investing through layers, keeping ledgers neat, and placing trust in managers who could deliver without noise. The pattern repeated across cities. The men who preferred structure tended to last longer than those who liked a crowd. The Flamingo changed hands, added rooms, and learned to sell itself not as a daring new idea but as a reliable stop on a boulevard of options. The fabulous in its name matched a tone that the whole town adopted. The Strip filled with properties that took what he insisted on: service, good design, a show that felt like an event and refined it. The Sands turned its lounge into legend. The Desert Inn offered quiet and green fairways. The Sahara leaned into a theme. Downtown kept buzzing with Fremont Street lights and a grit that never entirely vanished. The city discovered that hospitality could be an industry with rules, audits, and schedules rather than a hustle with stories. Regulation caught up with imagination. Nevada strengthened its oversight, put names on lists that barred entry, and made licenses into privileges that could be lost in a hearing room. The Federal Wire Act of 1961 hit the kind of interstate betting communications that had once been a backbone of his income. Bankers became more comfortable lending to hotel projects as the state's control tightened. The Teamsters Pension Fund, alongside traditional financing, bankrolled growth in the 1950s and 60s. Howard Hughes arrived and bought hotels in clusters, a signal that corporate hands would steer the town's future. By the 1980s and 90s, public companies ran the biggest resorts. Compliance officers replaced fixers. Conference rooms replaced back rooms. The Strip kept its smile while changing its spine. Through all of that, the story people told about him split into two simple versions, neither quite complete. In one, he is the father of Las Vegas, the lone visionary who planted palms in sand and turned a whistle stop into a city of light. That gives him too much. El Rancho Vegas, The Last Frontier, and other early places were already drawing travelers before he arrived. In the other version, he is only a violent man who got lucky with one hotel and paid for it. That gives him too little. He raised standards, connected glamour to gaming, and pushed a small town towards something larger. The most honest assessment says he was a catalyst who sped up a change that many hands were already shaping. The list of his crimes is not a footnote, it is central. As a teenager and young man, he ran protection schemes that bled small stores. During Prohibition, he made money in bootlegging and hijacking, diverting cargo that wasn't his. He aligned with a national order that settled disputes with fear, and at times, deadly force carried out by others. After Prohibition, he invested in illegal gambling, controlled access to the horse racing results wire, and used pressure to keep bookmakers in line. He was arrested more than once on gambling and wire charges, usually beating the case. He stood trial for the 1,939 killing of Harry Greenberg and was acquitted in 1,942 after crucial testimony fell away. He walked through Hollywood's union scandals without a formal charge while close to people who went to prison. These facts harmed people, corrupted parts of public life, and brought him wealth that he later tried to launder through a legitimate dream. That dream, the Flamingo, was built with real talent. He knew how a lobby should feel, how a showroom should sound, how a pool could turn into a memory if the landscaping was right. He demanded polish from staff and suppliers. He thought like a host. The project went over budget by a wide margin, and partners lost faith. Accusations about money leaving through side doors never stopped. The resort succeeded after a rocky start, but by then, his time had run out. His end in Beverly Hills remains officially unsolved, a result that fits the era. Important decisions made in quiet rooms left few traces behind. He disliked the nickname that the world placed on him. He wanted his proper name used, wanted to be seen as a man who had crossed into respectability. The nickname stayed, glued to him by headlines and the rhythm of a syllable the public liked to say. That small defeat explains a larger one. He could shape rooms, not the wider story. Others wrote it for him. If you need a clearer moral than life usually offers, hold two truths at once. He had gifts, presentation, nerve, an instinct for where American leisure was headed. He used them to commit crimes, to build illegal businesses, and to intimidate people who had less power than he did. He also used them to help define a city that would eventually learn to run on rules instead of whispers. Both statements can be true without canceling each other. Admire the precision with which a hotel can welcome a guest. Do not forget the cost of the road he chose to get there. Walk the Flamingo's garden in the morning, and you will see a modest marker with his name. It sits among palms and water, a quiet corner in a place built for noise. Visitors pause, read a few lines, and try to fit a whole life into that small space. The desert light makes everything look clean. It is easy in that brightness to imagine that the past weighs less than it did. It does not. It rests where it always has, in records, in families, in the way a city learned to build beauty with cleaner money after learning hard lessons about how not to do it. This is where we leave him. A boy who grew up cramped and hungry for better. A young man who found power in the wrong places. A middle-aged dreamer who tried to step into the daylight by building something that glowed. The sign still burns at night, though it has changed shape through the years. The city he hurried along keeps reinventing itself. His story remains a caution etched into the shine. Brilliance and harm can live in the same person, and ambition without guardrails can build a palace while it breaks the trust that holds lives together. Turn down the lights. Let the room grow still. Think of a lobby at closing time, soft music fading, the last guests drifting toward elevators, a night manager checking the list one more time. Somewhere in that calm, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the footsteps of the man who believed a desert could be elegant, and you can remember why some dreams must be built the right way or not at all. Close your eyes now. Let the desert quiet settle behind your eyelids, the soft hum, the distant glow, the hush after a long day. Let each breath untie a knot, each exhale loosen the last thread of worry. The story is safe now. It can rest while you do. Your room is calm, your pillow steady, your heartbeat finding the slow rhythm of sleep. Drift gently, light as evening wind over warm stone. Tomorrow will wait. For now, be easy. Good night, and well sleep.